What's up, my pilots? Harry Poncho here. Today is January 16th, 2024. And today I want to do the connections, and then I want to talk about Martin Luther King and kind of getting deep with some quotes from back then and a discussion about racism in modern America. So, if you're not ready for those heavy topics, you can look away, but know that you are part of the problem. So, first let's do the connections, get our brains wired up, start putting things together. I don't like to telling me like I've never played before. Alright, let's see. Hello is a pretty unique word in this list. I don't see anything else that looks like a greeting. Is it just words that have a double letter? Fool, skinny, eggshell, giggle, and scoop all have double letters. Dope and dupe. Okay, dupe and con and trick and fool, I think, are all the same thing here. All referring to pulling the wool over someone's eyes. Trick, fool, con, and dupe. So fool and con could also be nouns. So let's double check we don't have another word that means trick. I don't think we do. Dope, not really the same meaning. Yeah, deceive. Okay. Let's see what else we got here. Scoop, boob, slope, dope, hello. Interesting. So I think we have some words that mean tilted. Like cant, lean, and slope can all refer to something being on an angle. Like a canted ladder against a wall. I don't see a fourth word that really... Oh no, list can also mean tilt. Like the ship. Generally, ships are what's listing to one side. Or drunk people. Also listing. Slope, lean, cant. Let's see if there's another word for tilt here that's better than cant. Let's see one. So what else have we got here? Skinny. So skinny can be both thin, or it can be slang for knowledge. Like, you know, what's the skinny on such and such. Similarly with scoop and with word. So scoop, word, and skinny can all be slang for information. I think dope could also be as well. But then the last group would be boob, giggle, hello, eggshell. And the only thing I see there is that they're words with double consonants or double vowels. Alright, let's put in our angled list and see if that's correct. Indeed, tilting to one side. So, I guess we'll go with something like... Yeah. So what did I say the fourth one was? The skinny, the word, the scoop. And then the dope? No. I guess it would have to be dope, but although these could all just be not necessarily slang for information, but like what the New York Times would probably call urban slang. You know, what's the scoop word? That's dope. Let's try it. Inside info, if you say so. I've never heard of dope being used in that way. The other three make sense. And then for the last one, I can only guess it's something about having double letters. So these words have anything else in common? Boob, hello, giggle, eggshell. Nothing else. Let's see what they think this is. Words spelled with an upside down calculator? Yeah, I was never going to guess that. Oh my goodness. I mean, I knew you could do boobs and hello, but eggshell and giggle? I guess you can do a G with a 9? I'm trying to picture No, lowercase g would be a 6. 9 doesn't really look like much, except maybe a B, I guess. Strange. I always use an 8 for a B. But all right, so let's talk about Martin Luther King. We got a Simpsons reference here because, like everything, Simpsons did it first. Today we remember Martin Luther King, tomorrow we don't. Another reason I wanted to make this video on the day after Martin Luther King Day, when the rest of the world has kind of moved on from remembrance. I think it's important that we don't limit this discussion to Black History Month or Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday or Juneteenth or whenever. This is something that needs to be more cognizant in people's minds, and I think it has been over the last few years with like the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, racial justice and social equality and all that. It's been more on people's minds than it has been, I think, since the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that's a good thing. It's something that people need to be made aware of. And it's something that we'll talk about in a minute. It kind of makes me think of a quote from Martin Luther King, and not the ones that people usually say. We'll get there. So let me start with those quotes, actually. Let's go to those. So here's what I'm referencing. This is from the letter from Birmingham Jail. If you've not read, that's probably really small. If you've not read the letter from Birmingham Jail, you really should, because Jasper's back there whining in her little cat bed. You really should read the letter from Birmingham Jail. It's not only is it a remarkable piece of writing in advocacy for social equality and an end to the racial discrimination in America, it's also just a remarkably well-written piece of prose, in that the way that he builds the letter and the way that he writes his sentences, and one sentence in particular stands out, is in itself an art form. It's very well written, and it's something you could study in English class, which I actually did, and have things to say about it in the same way that you would about like Moby Dick or something. Highly recommended reading. Link in the description. Take note especially of the one sentence, which seems to never end, and how it ends. It's a beautiful demonstration through writing of the struggle of people of color in America in the 60s and earlier and later. But the quote is, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And that's absolutely true. And then I want to talk about this quote as well, which is especially relevant today. I'm going to skip a little bit in this, but whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It's something that has started to change today among some groups. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. That is like the definition of privilege. When you're in a position where basically bad things don't happen to you because you have a level of insulation that comes from your race or your gender expression or even just your appearance, you don't experience the things that are just part of life for other people. And you may not even be aware that those things are problems, constant problems for other groups, if you don't make an effort to educate yourself. You might recall the song from Bo Burnham's "Inside the Way the World Works," or maybe it's "That's How the World Works." I think it's just "How the World Works." It's kind of a perfect encapsulation of this, where people will try and turn that, into something about themselves. It's like, you learning that you have privilege is good, and it's an improvement for you to understand what your situation is and what the truth of the world is, how the world works. But it's not like a fucking yoga class or some self-help shit that you do in order to feel good about yourself. It's so you can actually be a better ally and like You could say be a better person, but not for your own sake, for the sake of others. Coming down to the end of this quote, for black people, they remember that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that, I'm not going to say the word, even though I guess it's not the word, that for colored people, they've come far enough, that you must remember that each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. And we're seeing that today. I mean, look at the nonsense that is the All Lives Matter movement. The way that predominantly white America has responded to these calls for, you know, the equality that was promised to Americans 60-ish years ago with the passing of the Civil Rights Movement. It's been a long-ass time. I'll give you an example of what that backlash looks like. Here's a quote from Charlie Kirk, the asshat behind Turning Point USA. This is just like, I don't know if I'd say it's one step removed from racism or if it's just openly racist. It's probably the latter. And he says, in reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I have a very radical view on this, but I can defend it. We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act. Which is like, what? He argues that on the basis, because of the Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination on the basis of race, by the way, it doesn't really go beyond that, it ushered in a permanent DEI-type bureaucracy, referring to diversity, equity, inclusion. And then coming down here, he says, the courts have been really weak on this. Federal courts will just yield to the Civil Rights Act as if it's the actual American Constitution. That's what courts do. They follow the law. Yeah, they're going to yield to it. It's the law. And then he says, the law is ultimately a way to refound the country and a way to get rid of the First Amendment. Does he think that, like, discriminating based on race is protected in the First Amendment? No. No. That's, like, this is what the ever-present backlash looks like. They're going to try and claim some other thing as being infringed upon by treating people equally and having it be required that people are treated equally. It's just nuts. Here I have an official page from the Justice Bureau, and I want to talk about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In that same song, How the World Works, Bo makes a sort of half joke by having his sock puppet character, who basically speaks the truth. And in that little scene, if you haven't seen it, link in the description, it's a pretty good metaphor for what the difference between being the oppressor and the oppressed is, or being in a position of privilege or being in a position of vulnerability. And that vulnerable character straight up says the FBI killed Martin Luther King. And I don't know if we're meant to take it as a joke or not, but it's not, quite frankly. The official story, and before you say this is a conspiracy theory, it's really not. There's a whole lot of questionable things in the official story that don't really line up. And there's really one predominant alternate theory about how this assassination actually went down. But I'll give you a brief bit of this in just a moment. But essentially, when they say the FBI killed Martin Luther King, it's more like the FBI orchestrated his assassination. It wasn't like some guy in a suit with sunglasses looking like Men in Black showed up and fired the shot. It's more removed than that. And if you're saying to yourself, the government wouldn't do that. Oh yes, they would. Oh yes, they would. The article for unethical human experimentation in the United States just reads like a list of government crimes against the people. So many of the things in this are specifically led by government organizations. So don't be under the naive assumption that the government's just playing nice and following the rules. I mean, most recently we had Guantanamo Bay. I guess it's been 20 years now since that was in the news, really. But I remember when Obama was elected in '08, one of the things he promised was to close it. Never happened. Turns out having an extrajudicial way to deal with people, these unpersons, is a useful tool for the government. Back in the day, you had to orchestrate an assassination. So let me read here a short excerpt, and I'll zoom in as much as I can on this portion for you. So sometime between 4 p.m., sometime before 4 p.m., Selena's crying out there. On April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray parked his white Mustang on South Main Street under an assumed name, rented a room on the second floor of the house above Joe's Grill, or Jim's Grill, which was just across the street from the motel where Dr. King was staying at the Lorraine. Shortly after renting the room, he purchased binoculars from a nearby store and then returned to the rooming house. Just before 6 p.m., Dr. King was outside on the balcony in front of his room, and at about 6:01, while having a conversation with associates in the parking lot below, he was shot and fatally wounded by a single bullet fired from a .30-06 rifle. The shot came from the direction of the rear building on South Main Street, which would be the grill, which is Jim's Grill on the first floor, and housing on the second floor, like a rental, like a motel, basically. And then within minutes of the assassination, police found a bundle on the sidewalk in front of Kennedy's record store, which is basically just next door. It contained a .30-06 rifle with a spent cartridge casing in the chamber, an attached scope, unfired .30-06 ammunition, and items belonging to James Earl Ray. His fingerprints were on the rifle and scope. Okay, we'll come back to that. Firearms testing could not positively determine whether the fatal shot was or wasn't fired from that rifle. The markings on the bullet removed from Dr. King's body matched the general rifle characteristics of .30-06 rifles, which means it would match any gun from that model. So this is basically the biggest hole for me. If you just assassinated somebody, are you going to leave the murder weapon and a pile of your possessions in a bag, like right next door? It's like, I know criminals are dumb and people do stupid things when they're panicking, but
So sorry, I'm trying to boil water and she's trying to help.
Selena's getting in the way of cooking. There's your cat video for today. But that just kind of seems like beyond the pale for even like panicked type thing. Also, if the rifle has a scope on it, there's no need to purchase binoculars. You can use the scope for that. And this is just one of like a dozen different things that don't really add up about this. But doesn't that just seem like a setup to you? Like, doesn't it kind of fails the sniff test, doesn't it? And there have been multiple investigations after the fact, but if you want to read this whole article, this is an official statement from the Justice Department, by the way. There's so many things that are just happy little coincidences that make it unhappy little coincidences, really, that make it impossible for evidence to be like factually determined. It's things like, well, the rifling was like non-standard, or it was just standard rifling for the .30-06 and didn't like match a particular gun. The bushes underneath the window were like out of season trimmed the next morning, destroying a potential crime scene by Memphis city employees, of course. And then the way things were handled after the fact, it's very strange. In particular, when James Earl Ray was eventually apprehended and he was actually extradited from London, he was coerced into making a confession on threat of the death penalty. Basically, the prosecution gave him a plea deal that if he pleaded guilty, they would take the death penalty off the table. And, I mean, the alternative would have been going to court and facing essentially the entire conspiracy alone with no, like, real assistance. So I can imagine that situation. It's basically like, I can either confess to this, or they're going to frame me even harder and I'm going to die in prison. And so he confessed. And then even days later was like, oh, God, I fucked up. I played right into their hands. Like, open court was the only chance we had for this, the truth to come to light. And eventually, so Luna, you're disrupting. You're being very disruptive. Do you want to come over here? No, she wants to be outside, but she can't be outside because Megan is cooking and she likes to climb on the stove. Anyway, you can read all about the official response to this. There was a civil suit back in '99 that focuses on this Lloyd Jowers guy. He was the one who owned Jim's Grill. He basically gives his side of the story and reveals that he was part of a conspiracy that included some local police and the FBI. So that's where the FBI killed Martin Luther King line comes from. And again, you probably think, this sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory. The government wouldn't do that. Oh, yes, they would. Oh, yes, they would. The Tuskegee syphilis study, if you don't know about this, this was conducted by the CDC. Like, literally, back in the day, the government, not only it's not an exaggeration to say that the government or the FBI was run by racists. Not an exaggeration at all. It's just the truth of the matter back in the day. So that's how you get shit like this to happen. That's how you get, it's crazy to me that people like think that it sounds like a conspiracy, that some like group of racists did a racist thing with the power that they wielded. It's like, why is this surprising? Why is this, concerning? So, interestingly, there are several other things that Martin Luther King liked to talk about that people, in the status quo, who were in favor of the status quo, did not like. That gives the FBI even more reason to want him silenced. For example, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a spiritual death. Another, the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and racism. The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. Keep in mind, this is 10 years after people were getting hauled in front of Congress for being suspected communists. Yeah. So there you have it. That is the slightly longer version of Did the FBI Kill Martin Luther King? And what that movement today looks like. So recognize when you see stuff like this that it was way, way worse back then. And although progress has been made, there is an ever-present tendency to backlash, and that backlash itself needs to be responded to and shut down. All right, heavy topics today, but I think it's important to talk about this stuff. There'll be links in the descriptions to all the different articles and Wikipedia pages that I've showed you, and as well as that Bo Burnham song that may have introduced the idea to some of you. So I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to look through and educate yourself. For this is all just a matter of public record, and people don't really talk about it much, and they should. I'll also include a link to the letter from Birmingham Jail, which is a remarkable piece of writing and really shows what Dr. King was capable of. He had a very sharp mind, and a way with words, too. I have a cat in my lap here, so I'll end the video with a little... Goodness, it's like jittering. Sit still. There we go. With a little view of her. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope you'll read some of the links below. and I'll see you tomorrow.